Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back about 800 years, pulling open a set of iron-banded oak doors, and walking straight into a medieval castle at nightfall. Not the postcard version. Not the fairy tale silhouette glowing gold against a purple sky. The real thing. Drafty, loud, smelling of smoke and wet wool, and something you sincerely hope is just a dog. You are going to spend the night here, and by the time the sun comes up, you will have a profound new appreciation for your mattress, your central heating, and the quiet miracle of sleeping alone. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there right now. I love seeing those roll in from every time zone, from someone in Manila at 2 in the morning to someone in Ohio who really should be asleep already. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive at the castle just as the last smear of orange light is dissolving behind the treeline. This is not a coincidence. Traveling after dark in medieval Europe is the kind of decision that shortens your life expectancy in ways both mundane and dramatic. Broken cartwheels, flooded fords, and the very real possibility of running into someone who wants your horse more than you need it. So you have timed your arrival to catch the gate before it closes, because once those doors are sealed for the night, no amount of knocking is going to charm the porter into reconsidering. You probably won't survive a night out there, and everybody inside already knows it. The gatehouse guard eyes you with the professional suspicion of a man who has been standing in cold air for 3 hours and has developed opinions about people who cut it this close. You state your business, traveler, merchant, minor noble riding to visit a cousin, whatever your cover story is, and he waves you through with the enthusiasm of someone who has already mentally clocked out. The portcullis is still raised, just barely, and the chains creak with a sound like a very large, very unhappy cat as you pass underneath. And now you are inside, and your first thought, honestly your first real visceral thought, is that it is much louder than you expected. The great courtyard of a working medieval castle is not a peaceful place even at the end of the day. It is, in fact, a small city compressed into stone walls, and small cities do not go quiet just because the sun has gone down. There are horses still being stabled on the far side, and they are not being quiet about it. Someone is shouting in the kitchen block, which is a separate building from the main hall because every castle architect in the medieval period understood that the combination of open flame, lard, and overworked cooks was basically a controlled demolition waiting to happen. 2 dogs are arguing over something near the well. A torch on the wall above you snaps and hisses in a gust of wind that finds the back of your neck with what feels like personal intent. Let's talk about those walls for a moment, because they are going to be a recurring character in your night. Stone, real, thick, uninsulated medieval stone, does something that seems almost physically impossible when you first experience it. It holds cold the way a sponge holds water. During the day, even on a mild day, the walls of a stone castle absorb almost no warmth from the sun, or at least none that they are willing to give back to you later. At night, they radiate a chill that is not dramatic or sudden but patient and creeping, the kind of cold that installs itself in your joints while you are distracted by something else and only becomes fully apparent when you try to stand up again. Medieval inhabitants called it, in various languages, essentially castle cold, a specific quality of chill distinct from outdoor cold or cellar cold, and they were entirely correct. Historians still argue whether the particular respiratory complaints common among castle-dwelling nobility in Northern Europe were caused by this chronic dampness or by the compensatory smoke inhalation from trying to fight it with fire, but either way, the walls are not your friends after sundown. The castle you have arrived at tonight is a reasonably prosperous one. Not a royal palace, not a crumbling border fort. Something in between. The seat of a landed lord with enough resources to maintain a household staff of perhaps 30 to 60 people. A great hall large enough to eat in together, a separate kitchen, a chapel, stables, storerooms, and the lord's private apartments in a tower or upper solar. This is, by medieval standards, comfortable. This is, by your standards, going to be a very long night. You are escorted loosely. Nobody is exactly holding your hand, toward the great hall, which is the social and functional heart of the castle. This is where most of the people in this building spend most of their time, and where most of them are going to sleep. As you push open the heavy door and step inside, the first thing that hits you is the heat, which is genuinely welcome after the courtyard, and then immediately afterward the smell, which is considerably less welcome. The Great Hall smells of everything that has happened in it today, which is a lot. It smells of the meal that was served earlier, some kind of roasted meat, bread, something with onions, ale that was spilled and not entirely cleaned up. It smells of the rushes on the floor, which are the medieval equivalent of carpet, and which are doing their level best. Fresh rushes, cut from riverside beds and laid down on a stone floor, actually smell quite pleasant. Green, slightly herbal, giving off a faint sweetness when walked on. The problem is that rushes are not changed daily. They accumulate, over days and weeks, the debris of a busy household, dropped food, candle drips, the passage of boots that have been through the courtyard, and the contributions of dogs who have made themselves comfortable near the fire and have no particular interest in going outside in this weather. Thank you very much. One particularly colorful medieval account, and the monk who wrote it seemed to derive a certain relish from the description, compares the base layer of an old rush floor to a kind of compressed archaeology of domestic life. There is apparently a point, somewhere between 1 week and 6 weeks of use depending on the household standards, where the rushes shift from floor covering to floor problem. Erasmus, the Renaissance humanist, visited England and wrote about the state of rush floors with the focused horror of a man who had genuinely not been prepared for what he found, and his comments have been quoted by disgusted historians ever since. You are going to try not to look too closely at what is under your feet. The fire in the Great Hall is doing its job, at least. The central hearth, in older castle designs, this is literally a fire pit in the middle of the floor with a hole in the roof above it. In more updated designs, there is a proper fireplace set into the wall with a chimney, is burning steadily, fed by logs of varying quality and throwing off warmth in a rough circle of maybe 10 to 15 feet. Beyond that radius, the Great Hall returns to stone temperatures relatively quickly, because the hall is large and the ceiling is high and physics does not respect your comfort level. There is a hierarchy happening in this room that you can read immediately just by watching where people are positioning themselves for the night, and we are going to explore that in great detail shortly. But for now, let your eyes adjust to the firelight and the shadows and the way the smoke moves in layers near the roof. There is always smoke, always. The chimneys of the medieval period being a work in progress across several centuries, and just take in what it means to be ending a day inside these walls. Because here is the thing about the medieval castle that no amount of textbook description quite captures until you feel it. It is a machine. It is a machine for surviving, for defending, for projecting authority, and it has been optimized entirely for those purposes. Your comfort is not an input variable that anyone ran calculations on. The walls are thick because arrows and siege engines are real problems, not because thick walls keep the warmth in. The windows are narrow because of archers, not because someone thought a lot of natural light might cause squinting. The Great Hall is a large single space because you need to feed and house a significant number of people simultaneously, not because open-plan living is on trend. Everything about the castle that will make your night difficult was a feature, not a bug, when the thing was designed. You find a spot near the edge of the fire's warmth. Not too close, because the side of you facing the flames will be uncomfortably hot while the side facing the hall will be in something close to refrigeration, a phenomenon that medieval people referred to as roasting your face while your back freezes, with the weary familiarity of people who have simply accepted this as a fact of existence. And you settle in. Around you, the Great Hall is beginning its nightly transformation from a place of business and sociability to something approximating a dormitory. Trestle tables, which have been set up across the hall for the evening meal, are being broken down and leaned against walls. The genius of the trestle table being precisely that it is temporary, collapsible, not a permanent fixture consuming floor space that will be needed for sleeping. Benches are being pushed aside. Pallets are being pulled out from storage, or simply rolled out from the corners where they have been stacked during the day. The light is dimming as candles are extinguished to save them. They are not cheap, beeswax candles especially, and a household burns through them at a rate that represents a meaningful expense, and the firelight becomes the primary illumination, dropping the hall into deep amber and shadow. Someone nearby is already asleep, or performing an impressive imitation of it, their cloak pulled up over their shoulders and their breathing slow and even. The castle at nightfall is many things. It is a fortress. It is a household. It is a workplace and a place of worship and a storage facility and a stable and a bakery and a prison and a great deal else besides. But for the next several hours, as the fire burns down and the cold creeps back in from the walls and the dogs settle and the torches gutter out in the corridors, it is going to be something else entirely. It is going to be a place where everyone is just trying to get some sleep. Some of them will manage it. Others, and this is something we will get into in considerable depth, had a rather more complicated relationship with the night than we do, structured by theology and practicality and the specific acoustic properties of sleeping 60 people in a stone room together. But that comes later. For now, just breathe in the smoky air. Feel the stone pressing its cold patience into the floor beneath you, and let the fire do what it can. Word count: 1,712. Wait. Catching myself here before I continue. This section has only reached approximately 1,712 words, which falls short of the required 3,000 to 3,500. Let me continue the narration seamlessly to hit the target. The sound profile of the castle at night is something you were not briefed on, and it deserves its own moment of attention because it is going to be the constant texture of the next several hours. You might have expected silence. Castles in the imagination tend toward a certain cinematic quiet, the creak of a weather vane, the distant call of an owl, perhaps a wolf howling at a tasteful distance. What you actually have is something considerably more layered. The stone walls, for all their thermal failings, are remarkable amplifiers of sound. Every footstep in the corridor above you translates through the flagstone ceiling as a clear, purposeful knock. The stables on the other side of the courtyard, separated from you by 2 stone walls, a courtyard, and a good 40 feet of cold air, still manage to send through the occasional complaint from a horse that has opinions about its bedding. Wind, which is picking up tonight as it often does after sundown, finds every gap in the castle's construction with a kind of dedicated artistry, producing a range of tones from a low moan in the gatehouse passage to an almost conversational whistle through a window shutter that has lost one of its fastening pins. And then there are the people. You are not the only one in this hall, not by a considerable distance. Depending on the size and occasion, a great hall might hold anywhere from a dozen to several dozen people trying to sleep simultaneously, and sleeping people, it turns out, are not actually very quiet. There is coughing, a great deal of coughing, because respiratory complaints are endemic in a world of smoke and damp and insufficient winter nutrition, and the shuffling of bodies on straw pallets, and the occasional sharp word from someone whose sleeping neighbor has rolled onto them, and the dogs, always the dogs, who seem constitutionally opposed to maintaining any settled position for more than 20 minutes. Historians still argue whether medieval people, who grew up in this acoustic environment and knew nothing different, simply processed it differently from how a modern person would, or whether they genuinely slept through it via a kind of trained habituation. There is something to be said for the second theory. The human brain is capable of remarkable adaptation to consistent background noise. Anyone who has ever lived next to a railway line and stopped noticing it after a month can attest to this. And the sounds of a busy castle household were, for the people born into it, simply the sound of the world. You, however, were not born into it, and you are noticing every single one of them. The floor beneath your borrowed pallet is making itself known in ways that are specific and persistent. Stone floors, even floors covered with rushes, and then a pallet, and then whatever bedding you have been allocated, retain their fundamental stoneness. They do not give. They do not adjust. They offer a consistency that, around the 3rd hour of lying on them, begins to feel almost principled. Historians have found evidence, in archaeological digs of castle sites, that some floors in private chambers were laid with a slightly raised wooden platform or boarding specifically to combat this problem, but that solution belongs to the upper end of the household, as we will explore in the next part of our night. Down here in the Great Hall, it is you and the stone and the thin social contract of the rush matting. Something about this, the cold, the noise, the smell, the unforgiving floor, might make you want to contrast it with our modern experience of bedtime as a ritual of comfort optimization, of weighted blankets and white noise machines and blackout curtains and the 17-step skincare routine that one of your housemates definitely judges you for in silence. And the contrast is real and worth sitting with. But it would be a mistake, a very common mistake actually, one that historians of daily life have been trying to correct for decades, to look at the medieval sleeping arrangement and read it as pure deprivation. as misery being endured. Because the people in this hall are not enduring. They are doing what people in every era do, which is living inside their normal. The Great Hall at night is warm enough by the standards of what warm enough means here. The floor is what it is. The noise is the noise. There is a kind of companionship in the shared space. The low murmur of voices still talking near the fire. The comforting animal warmth of bodies nearby in the dark. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, something our modern solitary sleep arrangements have largely lost, for better and for worse. The medieval night, as we are going to discover across the next several hours, is not simply an inferior version of our night. It is a different night entirely. Different rules, different rhythms, different anxieties and comforts and rituals and creatures, both literal and metaphorical. It has its own logic, and once you start to understand that logic, you begin to see that the people of the medieval period were not simply pre-modern. They were fully, completely, elaborately human, navigating their world with the full kit of human ingenuity and humor and complaint and habit. They just did all of it on a stone floor with a dog on their feet and smoke in their hair. The fire in the hearth settles with a soft collapse of burning wood, sending up a brief constellation of sparks toward the smoke-darkened ceiling. The hall shifts and breathes. Outside, you can hear the watchman on the wall making his rounds, his footsteps regular and slow against the battlements, a small human metronome marking the hours. This is the medieval castle at night. You are inside it now. Let's go deeper. The Great Hall is settling into its nighttime rhythm around you, and if you have been paying attention, and you have because the alternative is staring at a smoke-blackened ceiling and thinking about your back, you have already noticed something. The people in this room are not randomly distributed. They have not simply found a spot and dropped. There is a pattern to where everyone is, a spatial grammar written in wool and straw in proximity to the fire, and that grammar is telling you everything you need to know about where each person stands in the world. Medieval society ran on hierarchy the way your smartphone runs on battery, constantly, invisibly, and with dramatic consequences when it ran out. Every relationship, every transaction, every meal, every greeting had a vertical dimension. Who sat above whom at table? Who walked through a door first? Who spoke before whom? Who wore what color? And at night, when the business of the day was done and everyone was theoretically at their most equal, horizontal, unconscious, reduced to the same basic biological requirements, the hierarchy did not clock out. It simply rearranged itself into a sleeping formation. Let's start at the top, because that is where the logic originates, and work our way down through the layers of the castle until we reach the people who are sleeping in places you genuinely had not considered before we started. At the very apex of this particular castle's sleeping arrangement is the Lord himself, and he is not in this hall. He has not been in this hall at night for quite some time, because one of the primary markers of rising status in medieval domestic architecture is the progressive privatization of sleep. The earliest medieval lords did, in fact, sleep in the Great Hall with their household. The communal sleeping arrangement was originally the norm across all levels of society, a practical necessity of warmth and security in an era when the hall was the entire domestic structure. But as castles grew in complexity and affluence, as towers were added and upper floors constructed and the concept of private space began its slow centuries-long emergence, the lord and his immediate family migrated upward and inward. The solar, from the Latin solarium, theoretically a sunny room, though the naming convention was aspirational at best given the English climate, is the lord's private apartment, typically located on an upper floor of the main tower or a dedicated wing, accessible by a staircase that is narrow enough to be defensible and far enough from the Great Hall to provide a meaningful buffer of walls and distance between the lord's rest and the noise of his household. This is where he sleeps tonight, and the difference between his sleeping conditions and yours is approximately the difference between a modern boutique hotel and a festival campsite. The Lord's bedchamber contains an actual bed, a constructed, permanent, furniture-grade bed, and we are going to spend considerable time with medieval beds as objects in the next section because they are genuinely fascinating and strange. But for now, know that it exists, that it is raised off the floor on a wooden frame, that it has a mattress stuffed with something softer than rushes, that it has curtains, and that those curtains are not decorative. They are thermal engineering. They create a small, enclosed microclimate within the larger room, trapping the body heat of the sleepers inside the bed curtain perimeter and producing a pocket of warmth that is dramatically warmer than the ambient room temperature. On a cold night, and most medieval nights in Northern Europe qualify as cold nights, the difference between inside the bed curtains and outside them could be genuinely significant. The bed curtains are not a luxury. They are a survival feature dressed up as a luxury, which is a combination that medieval aristocracy was extraordinarily good at. The lord does not sleep alone, typically. His wife shares the bed, which is large enough for this purpose and, in prosperous households, large enough that the phrase sharing a bed does not carry the elbow-in-the-ribs implications it might in a smaller arrangement. There may also be a body servant, a personal attendant, often a young man of decent family serving in a household role as part of his education in noble service, who sleeps in the same room, either on a small bed or pallet near the door, or occasionally on a trundle bed that rolls out from under the main bed and then tucks away again in the morning. This person's job, among other things, is to be available during the night without requiring the lord to get up and cross a cold room to reach a bell pull, and their proximity is the medieval equivalent of 24-hour room service, which sounds glamorous until you remember that they are sleeping on a trundle in a drafty tower and can be woken at any hour for any reason. The lady of the castle, if she is not sharing the lord's chamber, which depended on the state of the marriage, the state of her health, and a variety of other factors, would have her own chamber, sometimes adjacent, sometimes in a separate tower, with her own ladies-in-waiting arranged around her in a descending gradient of comfort. The chief lady-in-waiting might have a small bed of her own, or at least a properly made-up pallet. The junior ladies might share a bed between 2 or 3 of them. The body servant at the very bottom of the waiting hierarchy might be sleeping on a bench or a chest near the door, wrapped in a cloak, performing the medieval equivalent of sleeping on the couch and being philosophical about it. This layering, the principal person at the center, attendants radiating outward in decreasing comfort, is the fundamental unit of medieval noble sleeping, and it replicates itself at every level of the hierarchy. Even a minor lord's son, sent to serve in a great household as a page or squire, would have his own small cluster of people around him arranged in the same pattern, like a fractal of social status repeating itself at different scales throughout the castle. Coming back down to the great hall where you are lying, consider the people nearest to the fire. They have not ended up there by accident. The senior household staff, the steward, the marshal, the chamberlain, men who hold real administrative authority within the castle's operation, have positioned themselves in the warmest real estate the hall offers. They may have slightly better pallets. They may have actual blankets rather than just cloaks. They are not in a bedchamber with curtained beds, but within the ecosystem of the Great Hall, they have maximized their circumstances with the quiet efficiency of people who understand that status is performed at every moment, including horizontal ones. The middling servants, grooms, kitchen assistants, general household workers, occupy the middle distances from the fire. Still warm enough, probably still close enough to the general social and thermal center of the room, but without the premium positioning of their seniors. A groom who has spent 10 years in a household knows exactly how many steps from the hearth he is entitled to, and would notice immediately if someone overstepped. These are not things that require signage or explicit instruction. They are absorbed over years as part of understanding how the household works. And then there are the people at the edges, near the doors, near the cold walls, in the corners where the firelight barely reaches and the draft from the gap under the exterior door runs steadily across the floor at ankle height. These are the newcomers, the lowest-ranking workers, the people who have not yet accumulated the seniority or social capital to claim a better spot. They are also, if you are honest about your own position here as a traveler without established status, roughly where you are. Welcome to the draft zone. Try not to think about the gap under the door. The children of the household, and there are children because castles are not museum pieces, they are homes, and homes contain children, have their own geography. Young noble children are in the solar or the nursery under the care of a nurse, wrapped in the warmest available bedding and watched through the night by someone whose job is specifically this. Children of servant families are wherever their parents are, tucked in next to them on the family's shared sleeping space, which is warm at least by virtue of being shared. One of the more striking things that historians of medieval domestic life have noted is that the concept of children having their own separate sleeping space, their own rooms, their own beds, the whole architecture of modern childhood privacy, is almost entirely absent from the medieval world. Children sleep with adults, not necessarily with their parents, depending on their station, but always within an adult social group. The idea of a child alone in a room at night would have struck most medieval people as bizarre, possibly dangerous, and certainly unkind. Historians still argue whether this communal sleeping arrangement for children produced meaningfully different psychological outcomes, different relationships to solitude, to darkness, to the presence of other bodies, but the practice itself is unambiguous. Alone at night was not the medieval default for anyone. There is a category of sleeper in the Great Hall that deserves special mention, and that is the traveler, the guest who has arrived as you have, without a permanent place in the household hierarchy, and who must be accommodated somewhere. Hospitality was a serious moral and practical obligation in medieval society. Turning away a traveler, particularly after dark, was not simply inhospitable. It was, in a religious framework that took these duties seriously, a potential spiritual failing, and in a practical framework that depended on reciprocal hospitality across long journeys, it was also strategically short-sighted. So you are here and you are given space. But the space you are given reflects your status as assessed at the gate. A wandering monk might be directed to a corner of the hall and given a blanket. A traveling merchant might be offered a slightly better pallet near the middle of the room. A knight of recognizable family might be given space in the upper hall or even a small private chamber, depending on what was available. A royal messenger bearing a sealed letter would be treated with an urgency and comfort reflecting the power behind the seal rather than his own person. And a high-ranking guest, another lord, a bishop, an important ally, would be given the second-best available private chamber, the best being always reserved for the lord's own use, because social reciprocity has its limits and everyone understood them. The castle thus becomes, at night, a diagram of its own social structure. If you could look down at it from above, from one of those bird's-eye architectural drawings that medieval artists were oddly good at, and trace the locations of every sleeping body, you would be tracing the castle's social topology as precisely as any written document of titles and offices. The floor of the Great Hall is a map. The solar is the summit. The distance from the fire is a coordinate on the axis of status, and everyone in the building knows their coordinates exactly. What is perhaps most striking about all of this, when you sit with it for a while in the amber and shadow light of the dying fire, is not the inequality, though the inequality is real and steep and not something to romanticize, but the sheer density of social information that everyone in this building is carrying and acting on at every moment, including the moments when they are supposedly unconscious. The Lord's body servant asleep on his trundle bed is performing a social function even in his sleep. The senior steward's position near the fire is making a statement that the junior groom's corner position echoes and confirms. The Great Hall at night is a document. It just happens to be a document written in sleeping bodies and firelight. You shift on your pallet, pulling your cloak tighter against the draft that has found you with its usual targeted precision. The fire has settled lower, the logs burning down to a thick orange bed of coals that still radiates substantial heat but casts less light, dropping the far ends of the hall into a darkness that is very complete. Somewhere across the room, the steward is a dark shape near the warmth, breathing slowly. You are at the edge of the map in the draft zone with the cold wall a few feet behind you pressing its patient cold into the air. And you have not even gotten to the bed yet. The actual beds, the objects, the constructions, the extraordinary social and material significance of what it meant to own a bed in the medieval period, are waiting for you upstairs in the solar, where the Lord has just drawn his curtains closed against the cold and the darkness in the world. We are going to go up there. Not yet, but soon. You are going to leave the Great Hall for a little while. Not permanently, the hall will pull you back, because it is the gravitational center of everything that happens in this castle day and night, but right now you need to go upstairs. Up the narrow spiral staircase that winds through the tower wall in tight clockwise turns. Clockwise specifically, a design choice so deliberate it became standard across centuries of castle construction, giving a right-handed defender coming down the stairs the room to swing a sword while cramping the style of a right-handed attacker coming up. Even the staircase is a weapon. Everything in this building has a second job. You emerge into the solar, and the first thing you notice is that it is warmer. Not dramatically, not sufficiently, but meaningfully warmer than the Great Hall below, and the reason is partly the fireplace set into the wall. a proper hooded fireplace, considerably more efficient than the open hearth downstairs, and partly the simple physics of heat rising through the building and collecting in the upper floors, and partly the heavy wool hanging on the walls, which is doing triple duty as decoration, insulation, and a canvas for the kind of tapestry work that took someone approximately the rest of their natural life to complete. But you are not here for the tapestries. You are here for the bed. It is, even by the standards of a moderately prosperous lord rather than a great magnate, a remarkable object. It stands against the far wall with the quiet authority of something that knows its own importance. It is tall, the frame raises the sleeping surface a good 2 feet off the floor, maybe more, high enough that getting into it requires either a small wooden step or a confident athletic commitment that probably becomes less confident after a certain age. It is wide enough for 2 people to sleep without enforcing intimacy, wide enough that the term bed barely seems adequate, the way calling a cathedral a building barely seems adequate. And it is enclosed, surrounded on 3 sides and above by a wooden framework from which hang curtains of heavy wool or, in a very wealthy household, something more luxurious. Linen, velvet, embroidered silk that can be drawn completely closed to create that thermal microclimate we mentioned earlier. This is the great bed of a medieval lord, and it is worth understanding just how significant an object it is, because we have almost entirely lost the cultural weight that beds once carried. In the modern world, beds are furniture. They are important furniture, arguably the most important furniture in terms of hours spent in contact with them, but they are replaceable, purchasable, available in a range of price points from the aggressively affordable to the quietly absurd. You can buy a bed this afternoon and have it delivered by Thursday. In the medieval world, a bed of this quality, the frame, the curtains, the mattresses, the bolsters, the coverings, represented a significant portion of a household's total wealth. Beds appear prominently in medieval wills and inventories, itemized with the same careful specificity reserved for land and jewelry. A man might leave his best bed to his eldest son and his second best bed to his second son, and this was not a trivial bequest. It was a meaningful transfer of substantial material value. The phrase second best bed, incidentally, has a famous appearance in the will of one William Shakespeare, who left his wife and Hathaway the second best bed in their household, a detail that has generated centuries of scholarly debate about whether this was an insult, a practical arrangement, or a term of endearment, and shows no sign of being resolved to anyone's complete satisfaction. But that is a few centuries ahead of where we are tonight, and Shakespeare would probably appreciate us not getting distracted. The bed you are looking at has, by the standards of its time and station, multiple layers. This is important. The mattress situation in a medieval bed is not a single component proposition. At the base, resting on the wooden slats or rope webbing of the bed frame, there is often a straw mattress, a large fabric bag stuffed with straw, which provides a degree of cushioning over the hard frame and can be replaced when it gets too compressed or too fragrant, which it will, and which you will understand more fully in a moment. On top of this, in a household of any means, there is a feather mattress or a wool mattress, a second layer, softer and more yielding, which is the surface you actually sleep on and which is the valuable component, the one that gets listed in the will. Feather mattresses deserve a moment's appreciation. They are filled, ideally, with goose down or the softer belly feathers of waterfowl, which are collected, cleaned, and stuffed into a linen ticking with a care that reflects their value. A good feather mattress is genuinely, luxuriously comfortable. The principle behind them is not so different from the expensive down duvets you can buy today, and sleeping on one, even inside a drafty medieval tower, would have been a sensory experience of genuine pleasure. The problem is that feather mattresses, like all organic materials in a pre-industrial domestic environment, are subject to a range of biological processes that their owners are in a constant, largely losing battle against. They compress. They develop lumps. They become damp and stay damp and begin to develop an opinion about it. And they become host to a variety of small organisms that we will address shortly when we talk about bedmates of the unwanted variety. Above the mattress, the bedding layers continue. There is a linen sheet, linen specifically because linen is the textile of direct skin contact, cooler than wool against the body, washable, smoothing out over repeated laundering to that particular softness that old linen develops. There may be multiple sheets, layered. Above those, wool blankets in whatever number the season demands, which in winter means several, heavy and warm and smelling of lanolin and the particular scent of wool in a warm enclosed space that is either comforting or overwhelming depending on your relationship with sheep products. And over all of this, the coverlet, the top layer, the visible layer, the one that might be embroidered or dyed or otherwise made to signal the wealth and taste of the household even when no one is around to see it. Because that is exactly the kind of thing that matters in a world where every object is a statement. The bolsters and pillows are at the head of the bed, and they are stuffed with similar materials to the mattress. Feathers in a good household, wool or flock in a less affluent one, and in the humblest sleeping arrangements, essentially whatever was available, which could include dried herbs, which sounds pleasant, and sometimes included material that sounds considerably less pleasant and which we will draw a discreet curtain over. Getting into this bed is a ritual. This is not an exaggeration for effect. It is literally a ritual with steps that are followed consistently and with purpose. The Lord does not simply fall into bed in his day clothes, because his day clothes are expensive and need to be put away properly, and because sleeping in the full armored or heavily layered garments of a medieval nobleman would be both uncomfortable and somewhat eccentric even by medieval standards. There is an undressing process, assisted by the body servant we mentioned earlier, involving the removal of outer layers, the unfastening of things that require unfastening, the putting on of a sleeping garment, typically a long linen shirt or gown, which serves the same thermal purpose as modern pajamas with the added benefit of looking extremely dignified in any portrait, and the careful arrangement of the discarded garments in a way that will make the morning dressing process efficient. The bed curtains are then drawn. This is the moment of transition, the medieval equivalent of closing your bedroom door, and it creates something remarkable: privacy. Real privacy, in a world where privacy is almost non-existent, where every waking moment is conducted in the presence of attendants and servants and household members and guests. Behind those curtains, in that warm enclosed dark, the Lord and his lady are alone in a way that is simply not available to them at any other point in the day. The curtained bed is not just a piece of furniture. It is the only private room in a world without private rooms. Historians still argue whether the psychological experience of this privacy, its rarity, its deliberateness, its association specifically with sleep and with the intimacy of the sleeping body, gave it a particular weight, a charged quality, that we cannot quite reconstruct from our position in a world saturated with privacy and solitude. Now let us talk about what was living in that bed with you. We have to. It is that kind of history. Fleas are the most famous residents of the medieval bed, and their fame is entirely warranted. The human flea, Pulex irritans, is a small, athletic, extraordinarily resilient creature that has been a companion of human habitation for as long as there have been warm sleeping bodies to inhabit, and the medieval bed, with its organic mattress materials, its warm enclosed curtain microclimate, its infrequent laundering, was a five-star resort for fleas. They were simply present, in quantities that ranged from annoying to genuinely sleep-disrupting, and the medieval response to them was less elimination than management. There are medieval recipes for flea repellents, mixtures of herbs and oils applied to bedding or person, that appear in household manuscripts with the matter-of-fact regularity of modern recipes for fabric softener. Pennyroyal, fleabane, lavender, and various other aromatics were used with varying degrees of effectiveness, and their presence in the bed gave the enclosed curtain space a herbal overlay that probably helped with the general olfactory situation even when it failed to deter the fleas themselves. Bedbugs, Cimex lectularius, were a parallel problem, and in some ways worse because fleas are at least mobile and can be chased. Bedbugs infiltrate the wooden structure of the bed frame itself, living in the cracks and joints of the wood and emerging at night with a patience and regularity that medieval sufferers found both infuriating and somehow personal. The bed frame of a castle that has been in continuous occupation for decades is, from the bedbug's perspective, ideal real estate. Stable, warm, regularly supplied with sleeping occupants, structurally complex enough to provide unlimited hiding places. One response to this, documented in household accounts, was the periodic disassembly and treatment of bed frames, which gives you a mental image of medieval servants taking apart a large elaborate wooden bed structure in a tower room and applying various preparations to the joints with the resigned thoroughness of people who have done this before and know they will do it again. There is a quirky historical footnote worth dropping in here. Some medieval households kept small dogs, the kind bred specifically for lap and bed companionship, distinct from the working dogs in the hall below, partly for the entirely practical reason that a small warm dog sleeping at the foot of the bed was an excellent foot warmer and contributed meaningfully to the thermal budget of the enclosed sleeping space. These dogs also, incidentally, served a secondary function of attracting fleas that might otherwise concentrate on the human occupants. Whether this was a deliberate strategy or a happy accident of companionship, historians have not settled, but it would not be the first time in history that a beloved pet turned out to also be performing useful pest management. The mattress itself requires maintenance that, by modern standards, sounds excessive but was, in context, simply part of running a household. Feather mattresses needed to be aired regularly. Taken outside on dry days and beaten, allowing moisture to escape and the filling to refluff, and restuffed periodically as the feathers compressed and broke down. The straw under mattress needed replacing on a schedule that better households observed more rigorously than others. The linen sheets needed washing, which in a medieval context meant a significant operation involving large quantities of heated water. Lye soap made from wood ash and animal fat, physical effort and drying time, all of which meant that laundering did not happen as frequently as a modern hygiene standard would prefer. The result of all this is that the great bed of a medieval lord, for all its genuine luxury relative to what was available below in the great hall, was also a complex organic ecosystem with a range of inhabitants and a smell profile that we should not pretend was neutral. It was better than the floor. It was better than the straw pallet. It was incomparably better than sleeping in the courtyard. But it was not, by our standards, clean in the way we mean when we use that word about bedding. And yet, and this is the part that is easy to miss if you focus only on the fleas and the feather maintenance, sleeping in that bed in that warm curtained dark was genuinely, deeply restorative in a way that mattered enormously to the people who experienced it. The softness of a good feather mattress after a day of hard physical activity. The warmth of the enclosed curtained space on a night when the wind is finding every crack in the tower walls. The weight of good wool blankets. The particular quality of darkness inside the drawn curtains, which is total and soft and insulating in a way that even expensive blackout curtains cannot quite replicate. Sleep, for the people of the medieval period, was not an inconvenient biological maintenance requirement to be optimized and minimized. It was understood as a genuine good, a restorative blessing, something the body needed and deserved, and that a comfortable bed delivered in a way that a straw pallet simply did not. The lord in his curtained bed and the servant on the hall floor were not just experiencing different levels of comfort. They were experiencing different versions of what nighttime rest even was. You stand in the solar for one more moment, looking at the curtained bed with its layers of linen and wool, its faint smell of herbs and lanolin and the particular warmth of an enclosed space, before the body servant's eyes open and remind you with quiet eloquence that this particular bed is not yours. Back down the stairs. Back to the draft zone. We need to talk about who else is in there with you. Back in the great hall, the fire has burned down another notch, and the room has settled into a deeper, slower version of itself. The coughing has found its rhythm. There is always one person whose cough has a kind of conversational quality. Just frequent enough to be a presence in the room without being frequent enough to justify intervention. And the dogs have made their final territorial negotiations and arrived at a sleeping arrangement that satisfies, if not everyone, at least the dogs. You are on your pallet, cloak pulled up, the cold wall doing its usual thing behind you, and you are beginning to understand something that no amount of reading about medieval life quite prepares you for. You are not sleeping alone. Not in the obvious sense. You have already taken in the full population of the Great Hall, the bodies distributed across the floor in their careful social geography. The steward near the fire and you near the door and everyone else arranged in between according to the unwritten rules we covered earlier. But not alone goes further than that tonight, and it goes in directions that are going to require you to make your peace with some things fairly quickly. Let us start with the humans because that is the easier conversation. Bed sharing between people who were not romantically partnered, between friends, between colleagues, between travelers, between members of the same household who simply needed to sleep in the same space, was not just accepted in the medieval world. It was normal. It was the default. It was, in many contexts, the polite and expected thing. The modern Western discomfort with sharing a bed with anyone other than a romantic partner is a historically recent development, a product of the 19th and 20th centuries and their particular anxieties about bodies and privacy and the meanings we attach to physical proximity. In the medieval period, none of those specific anxieties had yet been assembled into their current configuration, and the result was a sleeping culture that would look, to modern eyes, startlingly intimate. Inns, which you will encounter on the road between castles, and which we will use as a comparison point tonight, operated almost universally on the assumption that beds would be shared between strangers. You paid for a place in a bed, not a bed. The bed might contain 2 people or 4 or more, depending on demand, with everyone arranged head to foot or side by side under the shared blankets with the pragmatic unself-consciousness of people who have always done this and find your discomfort with it mildly confusing. Travelers who knew each other would request to share. Travelers who did not know each other would be paired by the innkeeper according to some calculus of perceived compatibility that was probably less scientific than it sounds. Complaints about bedmates appear in medieval travel literature with some regularity. The man who snored, the man who smelled, the man who talked in his sleep, the man who had apparently brought a personal livestock situation into the shared sleeping space. But the complaints are about the specific person, not the principle of sharing. The principle of sharing is simply not questioned. In the castle, the bed-sharing logic plays out within the household's social structure rather than the random pairing of the inn. Servants of similar rank might share a pallet simply because the pallet is large enough and body heat is a resource worth pooling. Ladies-in-waiting, as noted, share beds with each other as a matter of course, and the ladies' chamber on a cold night has a dormitory quality that would be familiar to anyone who has experienced boarding school or summer camp. Young men serving as pages or squires in the household sleep in clusters, sometimes in an antechamber outside the lord's room, sometimes in a dedicated space near the stables or the hall, and the shared sleeping arrangement is part of the texture of that life, unremarkable and unconsidered. There is a specific medieval document that illuminates this with wonderful incidental clarity, a set of household ordinances, written for the guidance of a noble household, which specifies in practical detail who should sleep where and with whom, and which treats the whole question with the brisk administrative matter-of-factness of a modern office seating plan. 2 grooms of the chamber here, 3 ladies there, the body servant outside the door but within call. It is a logistics document, not a document about intimacy, because in the medieval framework, these sleeping arrangements carry no particular intimacy beyond the warmth and the shared darkness. Historians still argue whether the near-total absence of the concept of sleep privacy in the medieval period reflects a genuinely different relationship to the body and its boundaries, or whether it was simply a practical accommodation to circumstances that people would have preferred to avoid if they could. The evidence, honestly, points in both directions at once, which is the kind of situation that keeps historians employed. Now, the animals. We touched on the small dogs upstairs in the solar, the ones doing their quiet dual service as foot warmers and inadvertent flea magnets. But the animal situation in the medieval castle at night is considerably broader than a few well-bred lap dogs in the Lord's chamber, and it is something you are going to need to confront directly because it is currently, at this moment, making itself known. The dogs in the Great Hall are working dogs, mostly. Hunting dogs, guard dogs, general-purpose dogs of the large and enthusiastic variety that medieval households kept in numbers that would alarm a modern home insurance provider. They are not in the hall as a special overnight treat. They live here. The hall is their space as much as anyone's, and they have a relationship with the rush floor and the fire and the general social geography of the room that predates most of the current human occupants. They sleep where they want to sleep, which includes on top of people who have made the tactical error of positioning themselves in a location that a dog has also decided is ideal. If a large medieval hunting dog decides that your legs are the warmest available surface in the hall tonight, and they are warm, you have to admit, in a way that is genuinely difficult to object to when the alternative is cold, then your legs are where the dog will sleep. And the negotiation about this will be entirely on your terms to initiate and entirely on the dog's terms to conclude. The dog will win. Everyone in this hall has already understood this about the dogs, which is why several people have arranged their sleeping positions with a subtle awareness of canine traffic patterns that comes from long experience. The cats are different. Cats in a medieval castle are working professionals. They are there for rodent control, and they approach this job with the focused independence of contractors who have read their scope of work and intend to stick to it. They do not seek human warmth with the dog's straightforward enthusiasm. They seek it on their own schedule and their own terms, which means that the moment you achieve a stable, warm sleeping position and relax into something approaching rest, a cat will materialize from wherever cats go between their appearances and install itself in the exact geometric center of the warmest part of your body, where it will purr with a volume that is both soothing and faintly threatening and will remain until something more interesting happens, at which point it will leave with the abruptness of someone who just remembered a prior engagement. The cats also hunt at night, which is their job and something you should in principle support, but which in the acoustic environment of a stone castle hall produces, at irregular intervals, a sudden violent rustling in the rushes, a brief scuffle, and occasionally a sound that is best not examined too closely. This is normal. This is the castle's rodent management system functioning as intended. You will get used to it, probably. The rodents themselves, mice and rats, both present in any medieval building that stores food and grain, which is every medieval building, are a background fact of castle life that manifests at night more prominently than during the day simply because the night is quieter and your attention has fewer other things to occupy it. They are in the walls, mostly, or under the floor, or in the storage areas that adjoin the hall. They are not a crisis. They are a condition. The cats deal with the ones that venture too far into the open. The rest conduct their business in the margins. There are also, depending on the season and the specific geography of the castle, bats. Medieval castles with their towers and their gaps and their accessible roof spaces are excellent bat habitat, and bats are largely nocturnal, which means that on summer evenings especially, you may be sharing the hall with creatures navigating by echolocation above your head in the higher shadows, performing their own form of hunting with a competence and silence that would be impressive if bats were not bats. Most people in a medieval castle have a perfectly matter-of-fact relationship with the bats, regarding them as they regard the rats, a condition of the building rather than a problem requiring intervention. There are, however, folk beliefs about bats that make some people less comfortable with their proximity than others, and we will get into the full texture of medieval night beliefs in a later section of our evening. Horses, technically, are on the other side of the courtyard in the stables and do not enter this particular social calculation directly. But horses are not quiet even across a courtyard, and a horse that is uneasy, spooked by something, uncomfortable in its stall, engaged in whatever horses do at 2 in the morning that requires audible commentary, will contribute to the acoustic environment of the hall in a way that carries through stone with surprising fidelity. The grooms who sleep in or near the stables are closer to this particular experience than you are, and their relationship with interrupted sleep has a specific equine flavor that sets them apart from their colleagues inside. Now here is the thing about all of this. The humans in your bed, the dogs on your legs, the cats appearing and disappearing, the rats in the walls, the bats in the rafters, that is easy to miss if you come at it from a modern perspective of contamination and personal space and the careful separation of human and animal domains that contemporary life has more or less achieved. It was warm, genuinely, meaningfully, practically warm, in a way that mattered enormously on a cold night in a stone building. A large dog lying against your back is contributing body heat at a rate that your cloak simply cannot match. The bodies of your fellow hall sleepers, distributed across the room, are collectively raising the ambient temperature of the space to a degree that is measurable and felt. The cats, dismissive and independent as they are small furnaces when they choose to cooperate. The collective biological warmth of a hall full of people and animals is not a trivial thing in a world without radiators. There is a wonderful medieval English phrase that turns up in various household texts, the idea of a sleeping chamber being well warmed by company, and it captures something that we have, in our pursuit of individual comfort and personal space, traded away without always acknowledging the trade. The medieval sleeper was rarely comfortable in the ways we mean by that word. But they were rarely alone in the cold, either, and the social warmth of the shared sleeping space, the knowledge that other bodies were near, breathing, alive, available, had a quality of reassurance that goes beyond simple thermodynamics. A traveler arriving at a strange castle, assigned a pallet in a hall full of unknown people, might feel the strangeness and the discomfort of it. But they probably did not feel the specific kind of loneliness that a modern person, accustomed to solitary sleep, might feel in the same situation but reversed, alone in a large quiet room with no sound of other breathing, no warm weight of a dog at the feet, no sense of human proximity in the dark. The medieval night was crowded. It was noisy and smelly and physically complicated in ways that our nights are not. But it was not lonely, and that is not nothing. You shift your position slightly. The dog has redistributed its weight in a way that has compressed your left leg against the pallet at an angle that is becoming concerning. And in doing so you disturb the cat, which had appeared at some point in the last 20 minutes and settled against your side with a warmth you had not realized you were grateful for until it stands, stretches in the elaborate full-body way of cats, gives you a look that conveys its feelings about the disturbance, and moves 3 feet away to settle again with its back pointedly toward you. The dog does not move. Of course it does not move. You lie there in the hall's amber dark, the fire a low warm glow across the room, the bodies of 30-odd people and an assortment of animals breathing around you, and you try to remember the last time you slept in a room this full of life. The answer is probably never. This is not, by any fair assessment, comfortable sleep. But it is sleep inside something, inside a community, inside a warmth that is collective and indifferent and entirely real. And there is something else waiting for you in this night that we have not touched on yet. Something about the darkness, and the cold, and the particular smell of tallow candles burning down to nothing. Something about what it actually looked and smelled and felt like to exist in the sensory world of a castle after dark. The fire shifts and settles. The dog breathes slowly against your legs. Let's talk about what you can smell. The candles are almost gone. Not all of them. The Great Hall keeps a minimal flame burning through the night, a practical and symbolic refusal of total darkness that we will get to in a moment. But the working candles, the ones that lit the evening's business and conversation and the clearing of the tables, have been extinguished one by one as the night deepened, snuffed between wetted fingers or with a small brass snuffer if the household runs to that particular refinement, each extinction dropping one more corner of the hall into the firelight's jurisdiction. The last candle near you went out perhaps an hour ago, and the smell it left behind, that specific, slightly greasy, faintly animal smell of a tallow candle recently extinguished, is still hanging in the air around you, mixing with everything else the hall has to offer tonight. Let us talk about the smell, because the smell of a medieval castle at night is one of those things that historians mention and then move past with what feels like indecent haste, and it deserves more than a footnote. It deserves, in fact, your full olfactory attention, because it is one of the most complete and immediate ways to understand how different this world is from the one you woke up in this morning. The tallow candles are a good place to start. Tallow is rendered animal fat, beef or mutton suet most commonly, and it burns adequately, providing functional light at a price point that makes it the standard illumination technology for everyone in the castle below the level of the Lord's personal chamber. Beeswax candles, which burn cleaner and brighter and smell considerably better, a warm, faintly honeyed smell that is genuinely pleasant, are expensive enough to be reserved for the chapel, for the Lord's private use, and for occasions important enough to justify the cost. The Great Hall runs on tallow, which means the Great Hall smells of tallow, a low, persistent, slightly fatty smell that is not offensive exactly but is very present, layering itself into everything it touches over time, including the walls, the hangings, and eventually the clothing and hair of everyone who spends significant time in the space. Add to this the smoke. Medieval chimneys are, as a category, a work in progress. The technology of the chimney, a properly designed flue that draws combustion gases up and out efficiently, creating the negative pressure that feeds the fire with fresh air and keeps the smoke moving in the right direction, was understood in principle and executed with varying degrees of success. The castle you are in tonight has a chimney that is better than a simple hole in the roof and worse than it should be, which is a description that covers the majority of medieval heating arrangements. On a calm night, the fire draws reasonably well and the smoke goes more or less where it is supposed to. On a windy night, and tonight is a windy night, as you have already noticed from the sounds the castle makes in the gusts, the smoke behaves with the independence of something that has never agreed to be managed and does not intend to start. It backs up. It drifts. It pools near the ceiling and then, following the private logic of fluid dynamics in an irregular stone space, descends in layers to where the people are. The result is that the Great Hall tonight has a smoke content in the upper half of its atmosphere that is not quite thick enough to be described as a problem but is absolutely thick enough to be described as a presence. Your eyes, if you have been lying in the hall for more than an hour or two, have a faint dryness to them. Your throat, when you swallow, carries the faint memory of smoke. Your hair, And everyone's hair in this hall, from the steward near the fire to the junior groom in the corner, has absorbed smoke the way cloth absorbs dye, steadily and completely. You will smell of smoke for days after this, and not in a campfire romantic way. In a lived-in, organic, this is just what people smell like way. The rushes are contributing their own chapter to the olfactory story. We touched on this earlier, the layered history of a rush floor in continuous use, but lying close to the floor as you are on your pallet puts you in a more intimate relationship with the rushes than you might prefer. The fresh top layer has a green, herbal quality that is genuinely pleasant, especially where someone has scattered dried herbs among the rushes as was common practice. Meadowsweet, which releases a faint sweet smell when walked on, or pennyroyal, or lavender if the household was prosperous enough to use it casually. But beneath the fresh layer is the compressed history of the weeks before, and that history has a darker, earthier quality that becomes more apparent to the nose as the night deepens and the air cools and the hall settles. There is also the smell of the people themselves. This requires a small historical correction before we go further, because the popular image of medieval people as universally, catastrophically unwashed is both exaggerated and misunderstood. Medieval people did wash. They washed their hands with a regularity that would surprise you. Hand-washing before meals was not just recommended but ritually enforced in noble households, with ewers of water and towels provided specifically for the purpose, and failing to wash your hands before sitting down to eat was a genuine social failing, not an oversight. They washed their faces, their hair, their bodies with a frequency that varied by social class and season and access to heated water but was not, in most cases, as infrequent as the stereotype suggests. What medieval people did not have was the industrial cleaning infrastructure that underpins our modern relationship with smell. No synthetic detergents. No deodorants of the modern variety, though various herbal and aromatic preparations were used for exactly this purpose with varying success. No easy hot water on demand. The result is that the baseline human smell in a medieval hall is not aggressively unpleasant. It is not the eye-watering assault of the unwashed that lazy historical fiction tends to reach for, but it is definitely present in a way that our modern obsessively deodorized bodies simply are not. It is the smell of bodies that have done physical work in wool clothing, in a heated space, over the course of a full day. It is warm and human and thick and entirely natural, and your nose, which has been calibrated by a lifetime of aggressive scent management, is noticing it. The wool itself, everyone's clothing, the blankets, the tapestries on the wall, the curtains of the Lord's bed upstairs, has its own smell that is layered through all of this. Wool, especially older wool in a warm, damp environment, has a particular earthiness that is connected to its origin in ways that polite textile history tends to elide. It is not unpleasant. It is, in fact, for many people who grew up with it, a smell strongly associated with warmth and safety. But it is present, adding its note to the hall's complex overnight fragrance profile. Historians still argue about the degree to which medieval people were consciously aware of these smells. Whether, in other words, the olfactory environment of the hall was simply the neutral background of existence for someone who had never known anything different. The way you do not smell your own house until you have been away from it for a week, or whether people actively experienced the smell as something to be managed or endured. The evidence suggests both. There is clear documentation of efforts to improve the smell of domestic spaces, the herbs in the rushes, the aromatic preparations, the use of incense in chapels partly for exactly this purpose, which implies awareness and preference. But there is also evidence of a baseline tolerance for ambient smell that differs significantly from our own. Now let us talk about the dark. The darkness of a medieval castle at night is a different category of thing from the darkness you experience in a modern building during a power cut, and understanding the difference is essential to understanding what the night actually felt like from inside it. In a modern building during a power cut, you are in darkness, but you know it is temporary. You probably have a phone with a torch function, and every window in the building admits the ambient light of the surrounding world, streetlights, the glow of other buildings. The generalized urban photon pollution that means true darkness is almost impossible to experience in any inhabited modern environment. You are also surrounded by the memory of light, by objects and spaces whose layout you know perfectly well under normal illuminated conditions. So the darkness is an inconvenience overlaid on a mentally lit map. The darkness of the medieval castle hall at night, with the candles out and the fire burned to coals, is darker than this in a way that is almost qualitative rather than just quantitative. There is no ambient light from outside. The windows, narrow, designed for defense, and in winter covered with oiled linen or wooden shutters rather than glass, admit nothing. The stars, on a cloudy night, contribute nothing. The fire's coals give off a faint red glow that illuminates approximately the fire itself and very little else. The darkness that fills the far end of the hall, the corners, the space above head height, is complete in a way that modern people very rarely encounter. Medieval people had a relationship with this darkness that was neither casual nor comfortable, and it was shaped by several forces that we will explore in detail when we get to the theology and folklore of the night. But the practical, sensory experience of it is worth sitting with first, before we get to the meanings layered on top of it. In the complete dark of the hall, your other senses sharpen with the automatic compensation that the brain performs when one input channel goes quiet. The sounds of the hall, the breathing, the fires settling, the wind, the distant horse, the cat in the rushes, become more present, more detailed, more directional. The smells you have been cataloging become more vivid. The feel of the pallet beneath you, the weight of the cloak over you, the specific temperature gradient between your face, which is exposed to the air, and your body, which is covered, all become more immediate. This is not an unpleasant experience, necessarily. It is an intensely physical one. You are very aware of your body, of its warmth, of the surfaces it is in contact with, of the air it is moving in and out. You are very aware of the other bodies nearby, audible and warm and present in the dark. There is a quality to this awareness that is different from daytime embodied experience, more animal, somehow more immediate, stripped of the visual information that usually dominates and mediated by the older, slower senses of smell and hearing and touch. The cold is part of this. We have mentioned it repeatedly because it keeps reasserting itself, as cold does. The cold of the castle at night is not dangerous cold. You are inside, you have a cloak, you have the residual warmth of the fire and the collective body heat of the hall, but it is persistent and present in a way that keeps returning your attention to your body, to the specific places where the cold is finding you, the exposed face, the gap where the cloak has shifted, the floor pressing through the pallet at your hip. You keep adjusting. The cold keeps finding the adjustment and installing itself in the new configuration. This is going to continue all night. There is one more sensory element worth cataloging before we move from the purely physical into the more complex territory of what the night meant, spiritually and psychologically, to the people living inside it. The light that remains. Even in the darkest medieval hall, light was not entirely absent. The fire's coals. A single candle kept burning in a lantern near the door. A night light, specifically maintained, because total darkness in a space with sleeping people and open stairs was genuinely dangerous and the household knew it. In the chapel, accessible from the hall through a low door, a small lamp burned before the altar through the night, an eternal flame that was never extinguished, combining the practical function of providing a light source with the devotional function of maintaining a continuous human or at least human-tended presence before God through the sleeping hours. These small flames, the coal glow, the lantern by the door, the chapel lamp, did not illuminate much. They did not push the darkness back in any meaningful way, but they marked the darkness, punctuated it, gave it a geography. You knew where the door was because the lantern was there. You knew where the altar was because the lamp was there. The darkness was not featureless. It had landmarks. This mattered more than it might seem. In a world where darkness was genuinely associated with danger, where the theological and folkloric weight of the night hours was considerable, as we are going to explore, the small maintained flame was not just a practical navigational aid. It was a statement. Said, "We are here, we are watching, something human is awake in this dark." Said, "The night has not won." You lie in the hall and watch the fire's coals breathe their slow red breath. The lantern by the door makes a small orange star in the dark. Somewhere behind the low door, the chapel lamp burns on alone. The cold finds the gap at your shoulder. You pull the cloak tighter. Outside, the wind shifts direction slightly and finds a new gap in the castle stonework, producing a new note in the building's nighttime repertoire, lower, longer, with a resonance that seems to come from the walls themselves rather than from any specific opening. And then something happens that you were not expecting. You wake up. Not from sleep, you had not actually been asleep, though you had been somewhere close to it, in the drowsy half-world where the senses are still running but the analytical mind has stepped back from the controls. You wake up from that, pulled back to full alertness by something you cannot immediately identify. The hall is the same. The fire is the same. The breathing around you is the same. But the night has shifted. Something about the quality of the darkness, or the quality of the silence under the noise, is different. You have just crossed into the second half of the night. And that, it turns out, is a much bigger deal than you realized. There is a concept that most modern people have never encountered and that, once you hear it, reorganizes everything you thought you understood about sleep. For the vast majority of human history, not just medieval history, but human history stretching back before written records, through the agricultural period, through the earliest settled communities, possibly all the way back to the pre-agricultural world, people did not sleep the way you sleep. They did not lie down at a fixed hour, remain unconscious for 7 or 8 continuous hours, and wake up at another fixed hour. That pattern, the single consolidated sleep block that dominates modern life with the authority of something ancient and inevitable, is not ancient at all. It is, in historical terms, extremely recent, a product of artificial lighting, industrial work schedules, and the slow reorganization of human time that accompanied the modern era. What people actually did, for most of history, was sleep in 2 separate segments with a period of wakefulness in between. The first sleep, sometimes called in medieval sources the first slumber, or in French the premier sommeil, began at nightfall or shortly after, when the day's work was done and the fire was banked and the hall was settling. It lasted somewhere between 3 and 5 hours, a deep, heavy sleep that served the biological restoration functions we now associate with the whole night's rest. And then, in the deep middle of the night, somewhere around midnight, give or take, depending on when darkness fell and when the person had gone to sleep, people woke up. Not accidentally. Not because of a noise or a disturbance, though those could happen too. They woke up naturally, the way you wake up at the end of a sleep cycle feeling rested enough to be aware of the world, and they stayed awake for a period of roughly 1 to 2 hours before settling back into a second sleep that carried them through to dawn. This second sleep was described as lighter, more dream-rich, more associated with a particular quality of rest that medieval writers seem to have valued distinctly from the first sleep's deeper oblivion. This is not a fringe theory or a disputed curiosity. It is documented across an extraordinary range of medieval and early modern sources, in medical texts, in court records, in devotional literature, in personal letters and diaries, with a matter-of-fact consistency that makes it clear this was simply how everyone understood sleep to work. The phrases used, first sleep, second sleep, the watch between the sleeps, appear without explanation, the way you might write breakfast without feeling the need to define it, because everyone reading already knows what you mean. The historian Roger Ekirch spent decades assembling the documentary evidence for this pattern, and his work represents one of those genuinely clarifying moments in historical scholarship where something previously invisible becomes, once pointed out, impossible to unsee in the sources. Historians still argue about the precise universality of the pattern, whether it applied equally across all social classes, all climates, all seasons, and all individual sleep physiologies. But the broad existence of the two-sleep pattern in the medieval world is, at this point, as solid as historical evidence gets, which means that you're waking up just now, in the deep middle of the night with the fire burned low and the hall at its darkest and quietest, is not an interruption of the night's sleep. It is the night's sleep working correctly. You are in the watch, and the question of what people did during the watch, during this 1 to 2 hours of sanctioned, expected, middle-of-the-night wakefulness, is where things get genuinely interesting, because the answer varies by person and circumstance and reveals something important about how the medieval period understood the relationship between night, rest, the body, and the spirit. For some people, the watch was productive time. Medieval medical thinking, drawing on the ancient humoral tradition and its understanding of the body's internal rhythms, suggested that the period between the two sleeps was an excellent time for certain activities. The body was rested from the first sleep but not yet committed to the second, in a state of balanced, calm wakefulness that was considered physiologically optimal for things requiring mental clarity without the full expenditure of daytime energy. Reading, in households where reading was possible, where there were books and literacy and someone willing to maintain a candle through the night hours. Prayer, which we will come back to in a moment because it is central. Quiet conversation between bed partners, a category of talk that medieval sources suggest had a particular intimacy and honesty distinct from the conversations of the day. Some medical texts of the period recommended the watch as the appropriate time for marital relations, on the grounds that both parties were rested from the first sleep and the body's humoral balance at that hour was considered propitious. This is a piece of medieval practical physiology that tends to get a certain reaction when it comes up in lectures, but it appears earnestly in serious medical literature and reflects the general medieval tendency to integrate bodily and spiritual life within a single coherent framework rather than treating them as separate domains. For others, the watch was a liminal time, neither day nor night, neither fully asleep nor fully awake, and it carried the particular quality of mind that liminal times tend to produce. Thoughts that will not come in the busyness of the day find you in the quiet of the watch. Worries that are manageable in daylight expand in the dark middle of the night to fill whatever space you give them. The watch was a time when people thought, really thought in the sustained, uninterrupted way that daily life rarely permits, about the things that mattered to them. Debts owed and owing, relationships strained or sweetened, plans forming and dissolving, the dead. In the great hall, the watch manifests quietly. You are not the only one awake, you are never going to be in a room this full, but the waking is distributed and private. The person near the fire has rolled over and is staring into the coals with the focused attention of someone working through something. Two people near the middle of the hall are talking in voices too low to carry across the room, not quite whispering but close to it, the rhythm of the exchange slow and unhurried. Someone near the far wall has gotten up and is moving toward the door, probably heading for the latrine, the garderobe as the medieval period called it, a word whose etymology is genuinely delightful and which we will get to, with the careful quiet of a person trying not to wake their neighbors. The castle itself feels different in the watch. The darkness is the same, the cold is the same, but the quality of the silence has shifted. During the first sleep, the hall's noise was the noise of sleeping people, the unconscious contributions of coughing and turning and snoring. Now it is the noise of people quietly awake, which is a different texture entirely, more deliberate, more human, more aware of itself. Let us talk about prayer because you cannot understand the medieval night without it. The Christian liturgical tradition had, over the centuries preceding this night, developed a structure for the hours of the day and night that organized time into a sequence of prayer offices. Fixed points of worship distributed across the full 24 hours, each with its own character and content and theological significance. For monks and nuns living in religious communities, these offices were the spine of every day and every night, observed with a discipline that made the clock a devotional instrument. For lay people in the wider world, including everyone sleeping in this castle tonight, the offices were less immediately pressing but not irrelevant. The bells of the castle chapel, and the bells of whatever church or monastery was within earshot, marked the hours of the night with a regularity that everyone heard and that carried meaning even for those not actively participating. Matins, the night office, observed roughly in the middle of the night, fell during or near the watch between the two sleeps. This was not a coincidence. The timing of the night office had been calibrated over centuries to coincide with the period of natural wakefulness, and the result was a reinforcing loop. Religious practice confirmed and gave meaning to a biological pattern, and the biological pattern made the religious practice feel natural and right. Waking in the middle of the night was not just something that happened to you. It was, in the theological framework of the period, an opportunity, an invitation. The quiet hours of the watch were understood as particularly conducive to prayer, particularly close to God, particularly stripped of the distractions that daytime devotion had to compete with. For the devout, and in the medieval period, devout was not the exceptional description it might be today. Sincere religious practice was simply the default mode of most people's relationship with the world. The watch might include actual prayer, either in the hall where you lay or, for those inclined to the extra effort, a visit to the chapel. The chapel lamp we mentioned earlier, burning through the night beside the altar, was there for exactly this. For the person who woke in the small hours and wanted to place themselves before God in the particular way that the quiet dark permitted. In the Lord's Solar, the nightly rhythms of prayer were more formalized. A private chaplain, if the household was wealthy enough to maintain one, would have his own office obligations, observing the night hours in the castle chapel with the regularity of his vocation. The Lord himself might have a small prie-dieu, a kneeling desk for personal prayer, in or near his chamber, used during the watch for exactly the private devotional purposes that the medieval understanding of the night encouraged. His lady similarly. The curtained bed, which we established earlier as the only truly private space available to people of this period, was also a space of private prayer, and the prayers said in that enclosed dark before and after sleep were understood as some of the most intimate and honest communications a person could have with God, precisely because the usual social performances were suspended and nothing remained but the praying self in the dark. The liturgical structure of the night also explains something about the castle that might otherwise seem puzzling. Why people knew what time it was, without mechanical clocks, which existed in the medieval period in increasingly sophisticated forms but were not yet the small personal timekeepers they would later become. Time was tracked by the bells of the hours, by the stars when the sky was clear, by the quality of the darkness, and by the body's own rhythms, which the two-sleep pattern kept reliably synchronized with the night's progress. Medieval people were, in this sense, more attentive to time's texture than we are, more practiced at reading the night by its feel and sound, less dependent on a glowing numerical display. The watchman on the walls, whose footsteps you heard earlier, is part of this nocturnal timekeeping system. His job is not just security, though it is that. It is also the human marking of time's passage, the audible confirmation that the night is being attended to, that someone with open eyes and a sense of the hours is moving through the darkness and noting its progress. In some castles, the watchman called the hours, a shouted or sung announcement of the time that functioned as an alarm clock for the whole building, penetrating sleep and the watch alike, orienting everyone within earshot in the night's chronology. There is a particularly charming documented practice in some medieval households, charming and also faintly exhausting, of the night watch not just calling the hours but singing them, delivering a brief sung announcement of the time and sometimes the weather and occasionally a pious sentiment about the state of the soul in the small hours. The combination of practical information and spiritual encouragement delivered by a man on a cold stone battlements at 2 in the morning has a quality that is difficult to characterize exactly but that sits somewhere between moving and absurd, which is honestly a very medieval combination. You lie in the hall during your watch, feeling the particular quality of middle-of-the-night wakefulness, that clear, slightly heightened alertness that is different from daytime awareness, quieter and more inward, and you think about the structure of this night as you are experiencing it. You came in at the edge of darkness. You watched the hall settle. You observed the social geography of the sleeping space and the crowded warmth of its inhabitants. You have catalogued the smells and navigated the darkness and felt the cold's persistent attentions. You slept your first sleep without quite noticing when it took you, and now you are here in the watch, awake and thinking. The two people near the middle of the hall are still talking, their voices a low warm thread in the cold dark. The fire has been fed. Someone got up during the first sleep, as someone always does, and added wood, which is now burning steadily and pushing the cold back by another foot or two. The hall smells of fresh smoke and old rushes and the warm animal smell of everyone in it. Outside, the watchman is making his round, his footsteps steady on the battlements. You can hear them through the wall or think you can in the particular auditory alertness of the watch. In the chapel, the lamp burns on. The second sleep is coming. You can feel it at the edges of your awareness, a softening and heavying that is different from the sharp wakefulness of the past hour. The watch is ending. The night is turning toward its second half, which will carry you, if nothing interrupts, if the castle's nocturnal population cooperates, if the theological framework is correct about the restorative properties of this second, lighter, dream-rich sleep, through to the first gray suggestions of dawn. But before you go under again, before the second sleep takes you, let us stay in this threshold moment just a little longer. Because the watch is also, in the medieval understanding, the hour when the membrane between the waking world and other worlds is at its most permeable. The hour when the soul, freed from the day's demands but not yet submerged in sleep, is most open to what comes in the dark. What comes in the dark is our next topic. And some of it, by the standards of the people in this hall, is considerably more alarming than the cold or the fleas or the dog on your legs. The watch is the hour of the open door. This is not a metaphor that requires translation. It is close to how the medieval mind actually framed it, drawing on a theology and a folk understanding of the night that treated the sleeping and waking states not as simply different levels of consciousness but as different modes of existence, each with its own set of rules about what could approach you and what you were vulnerable to and what obligations the waking world's protections placed on the soul moving through the dark hours. The door in question was the door of the self, and during sleep, and especially during the liminal threshold of the watch, when you were neither fully asleep nor fully awake, it stood open in a way it did not during the defended alertness of the day. What came through that door was the subject of an enormous, sprawling, deeply serious body of medieval thought that encompassed theology, medicine, folk belief, legal practice, and the kind of first-person testimony that turns up in chronicles and confession records and miracle accounts with a frequency that makes it clear people were not talking about rare or marginal experiences. They were talking about things that happened to them regularly, things they expected to happen, things that shaped their behavior and their devotional practice and their sleeping arrangements in ways that are still visible in the documentary record. Let us start with dreams, because dreams are where the medieval engagement with the night mind is most elaborate and most thoroughly documented. The medieval theory of dreams was not a single unified system. It was characteristically a rich and sometimes contradictory layering of classical inheritance, Christian theology, and folk wisdom that different thinkers and different traditions weighted differently. But certain broad frameworks recurred consistently enough to constitute something like common understanding. The most widely inherited framework came from the ancient world, specifically from the tradition of dream classification that medieval scholars encountered through late antique sources. Dreams were understood to fall into several categories based on their origin and their truthfulness. There were the meaningless dreams, the somnia, caused by the body's physical state, by what you had eaten or drunk, by the humoral imbalances of illness or exertion, which were essentially the noise of the biological system running its overnight maintenance and carried no prophetic or spiritual significance. There were the dreams sent by God, clear, luminous, direct, often featuring a figure of authority delivering a message, which were prophetic and true and required both taking seriously and careful interpretation. And there were the dreams sent by malevolent forces, deceptive, seductive, designed to mislead, which were the most dangerous category precisely because they could appear indistinguishable from the divine variety. The practical challenge, which medieval dream interpreters addressed with an intellectual seriousness that produced a substantial body of literature, was telling these categories apart. A vivid, meaningful feeling dream might be divine communication, diabolical deception, or the consequence of eating too much salt pork before bed. The signs that helped distinguish them, the moral character of the dreamer, the emotional quality of the dream, its internal coherence, whether it came in the first sleep or the second, were debated by theologians and compiled in dream manuals that circulated through literate households and monastic libraries with genuine practical intent. Historians still argue about the degree to which ordinary lay people engaged with this elaborate taxonomic framework versus operating on a simpler folk understanding of dreams as significant communications from beyond the waking world. The answer was probably both simultaneously, the folk belief and the theological system coexisting and informing each other, as they did in most domains of medieval religious life. What is clear from the sources is that medieval people paid serious attention to their dreams. They remembered them, recounted them, sought interpretation of them, and made decisions based on them in ways that modern secular culture would find somewhere between charming and alarming. Kings took counsel from dreams. Pilgrimage destinations were chosen based on dream instructions. The sick sought healing dreams by sleeping near saints' relics, a practice called incubation with roots in the ancient world that the medieval church managed to simultaneously disapprove of theologically and accommodate practically because the demand for it was simply too persistent to suppress. The second sleep, that lighter, dream-rich phase we mentioned in the last section, was understood as the primary arena for meaningful dreaming, and this understanding has some support from modern sleep science, which notes that REM sleep, when most vivid dreaming occurs, is more concentrated in the later portions of the night. The medieval experience of waking from the second sleep into the gray early morning with the residue of a vivid dream still present and pressing for interpretation was sufficiently common to generate a whole body of morning practice around it. The immediate recounting to a bed partner or confessor, the consultation of a dream book if one was available, the private act of trying to remember and decode what the night had sent. But dreams were not the most alarming thing the medieval night could offer. The thing that occupied a particular visceral place in medieval nocturnal anxiety was the night visitor, the creature or force that came to sleeping people not in the representation of a dream, but in a way that felt more immediate, more physical, more unambiguously real than any dream. We are talking about the experience that medieval sources called, in Latin, the incubus or succubus, and in vernacular languages by a variety of regional names, in English, the Mara or the nightmare, in German, the Nachtmar, in Scandinavian tradition, the mare, and which was understood not as a dream but as an actual nocturnal visitation by a being of supernatural origin. The experience being described in these accounts maps with remarkable consistency onto what modern medicine calls sleep paralysis, a state that occurs in the transition between sleep and waking, particularly in the hypnagogic period just before sleep or the hypnopompic period just after it, during which the sleeper becomes conscious while the motor inhibition of REM sleep has not yet fully lifted. The person is awake, aware, capable of perceiving their surroundings, but unable to move, sometimes unable to breathe normally, and frequently experiencing vivid hallucinations of a presence in the room. A figure, a weight, a pressure on the chest that feels absolutely terrifyingly real. Sleep paralysis is a documented neurological experience that affects a significant portion of the population at some point in their lives, and it is cross-cultural and transhistorical. Accounts of it appear in sources from ancient Mesopotamia to classical Rome to medieval Europe to contemporary clinical case studies, with the specific cultural interpretation varying, but the core physical experience remaining remarkably consistent. In the medieval period, the cultural interpretation was an actual demonic or supernatural visitor, and this interpretation was not the fringe belief of the credulous. It was the mainstream understanding, supported by theological authority and confirmed by an enormous body of reported personal experience. The Mara, the nightmare in its original sense, before the word became generalized to mean simply a bad dream, sat on your chest while you slept and pressed the breath out of you. This was not understood as metaphor. It was understood as a physical reality, a being of malevolent intention that came to sleeping bodies and crushed them, sometimes with sexual intent, sometimes with simple malice, sometimes as part of a larger pattern of spiritual attack that required clerical intervention. The word nightmare preserves this original meaning in its structure. The mare was the visitor, the night was when it came, and the compound described the specific experience of nocturnal supernatural assault that was one of the more reliably terrifying features of the medieval sleeping experience. The defenses against nocturnal supernatural visitors were numerous, practical, and integrated into bedtime routine with the same matter-of-fact regularity as banking the fire or removing your outer garments. Prayers said before sleep were the primary protection. Specific prayers recommended by confessors and preserved in books of hours and personal prayer collections, addressed to appropriate saints and to God, requesting protection through the night hours. The sign of the cross made over oneself and over the bed. Holy water, kept in a small vessel in the chamber and applied to the sleeper and the sleeping space. Specific herbs, particularly those with a long folk association with protection and warding, tucked into the mattress or hung near the bed. There is a quirky documented practice from several regions of medieval Europe involving the placing of iron objects near or under the bed, based on the widespread folk belief that supernatural creatures of the night variety were repelled by iron. This belief, iron as a ward against malevolent supernatural beings, is ancient enough that its origins are genuinely obscure, predating the medieval period by centuries and surviving well beyond it into the folklore of the modern era. Historians still argue whether the association of iron with supernatural protection reflects some very ancient cultural memory of the transition from Bronze to Iron Age technology, giving iron a kind of sacred novelty that calcified into permanent magical association, or whether it has some other origin entirely. Either way, there were medieval people sleeping with iron objects under their pillows for the same reason you might sleep with your phone nearby, the comfort of a specific protection against a specific anxiety. In the Great Hall below the solar, the communal sleeping arrangement offered its own form of protection against the night's visitors, and this was understood, at least implicitly, as one of its advantages. The Mara and the incubus and the various other creatures of the medieval nocturnal were generally understood to prefer solitary victims. A sleeping person surrounded by other sleeping people, in a space maintained by the small flame of the night light and within earshot of the chapel's continuous devotional presence, was in a better spiritual position than a person sleeping alone in the dark. The communal warmth we talked about earlier had a supernatural dimension alongside the thermal one. You were harder to get to when surrounded by your household. The night's malevolent visitors preferred the isolated, the solitary, the spiritually undefended. This understanding cast the Lord's private bedchamber in a slightly different light, the luxury of privacy carrying with it a specific vulnerability that the communal hall did not share, which is perhaps part of why the body servant outside the curtained bed was not just a convenience but a presence, a human anchor to the waking world, a witness against whatever the night might bring. The dreams that the medieval sleeper valued most positively, the prophetic dream, the visitation of a saint, the guidance of a deceased relative delivering important information about the location of a will or the state of their soul in purgatory, were also, in the taxonomy of the night, real events rather than mere experiences of consciousness. A saint appearing in a dream was understood to have actually appeared, to have actually delivered the message, to have actually performed any healing or protection the dream described. The boundary between dream experience and waking reality was not, in the medieval framework, as fixed and impermeable as our modern psychology tends to assume. The night was a permeable time, and what passed through the permeable membrane in both directions, saint and demon, divine message and diabolical deception, was real. This has a practical consequence for our night in the castle that is worth pausing on. The people sleeping around you in the Great Hall are not simply unconscious biological systems running their maintenance cycles. They are, in their own understanding, souls temporarily freed from the constraints of waking embodiment, exposed to a range of spiritual encounters, and protected or endangered by the quality of their devotional preparation for the night. The prayers said before sleep were not just soothing ritual. They were, in the most serious medieval understanding, actual spiritual armor against actual spiritual threat. The person who fell asleep without prayer was not just being irreligious. They were going into dangerous territory unprotected. The children of the household, whom we mentioned earlier sleeping in the warmth of adult company, were considered particularly vulnerable to nocturnal spiritual hazards, and the protections extended to them, the prayers over them, the holy water, the specific saints invoked for the protection of the young, were correspondingly more elaborate. A medieval nurse's bedtime practice was as much spiritual management as physical comfort, and the lullabies preserved from the period often contain a protective theological content, invocations of specific saints, requests for angelic guardianship, that sits in the lullaby form the way raisins sit in bread, so integrated as to seem natural but serving a purpose quite different from simple melody. There is also a category of medieval nocturnal experience that sits in interesting territory between the supernatural and the psychological, and that is the visitation of the dead. Dreams of deceased relatives were common, expected, and theologically significant in the medieval world in ways that go beyond the general significance of prophetic dreaming. In a theological framework that included purgatory, the intermediate state where souls underwent purification before reaching heaven, the dead were not simply gone. They were present, accessible, potentially in need of assistance in the form of prayers and masses said by the living, and capable of communicating their needs through the permeable medium of the sleeping mind. A deceased parent appearing in a dream was quite likely asking for something specific. A mass to be said, a debt to be discharged, a wrong to be set right, an obligation unfulfilled in life to be honored in death. These requests were taken seriously and acted on in the waking world, because ignoring them was both unkind to the dead and potentially dangerous to the dreamer. The relationship between the living and the dead in the medieval castle was thus not confined to daylight hours and formal commemorations. It extended into the night, into sleep, into the specific hours of the watch when the door stood open and the soul was accessible. The dead came, and they asked, and the living answered, and this exchange was part of the texture of the night as completely as the cold and the dogs and the smoke. You are lying in the hall in your second sleep now, or approaching it, the watch having done its work, the thinking, the praying, or the simply being awake in the dark, the small inventory of the day's events and concerns, and the second sleep reaching for you with its characteristic gentleness, lighter than the first, more welcoming of the images that drift across the threshold of consciousness as you descend. The fire has been fed again. The hall is warm enough. The dog is still on your legs, unmoved and unmovable. a warm and entirely secular presence in a night full of theological complexity. You close your eyes. The darkness behind them is different from the darkness of the hall. It is yours, internal, personal, the darkness of a mind preparing for its second immersion in the night. Whatever comes through the open door tonight, you have said your prayers. Or at least, you are hoping the medieval version of you had the presence of mind to do so before the first sleep took you, because skipping that step in this particular theological and folkloric landscape seems like exactly the kind of corner cutting that the night tends to punish. The castle breathes around you. The walls hold their cold. The lamp burns in the chapel. And somewhere in the building, someone is awake who never sleeps at all. While you have been moving through your first sleep and your watch and now the soft descent into your second, the castle has not been idle. This is the thing about a medieval castle at night that gets lost when you focus on the sleeping. The sleeping is only half the story, and it is not even the half that kept the building standing. Underneath the great hall's dormitory quiet, behind the solar's curtained warmth, beyond the chapel's solitary lamp, there is a whole other castle running in parallel, staffed by people who are not sleeping and will not sleep, who are awake by duty or necessity or the particular demands of their trade, and who constitute the nocturnal skeleton on which the sleeping castle's comfort depends. Let us start at the walls. The watchman whose footsteps you have been hearing at intervals through the night is not a single person. He is a rotation, a system, a carefully managed schedule of human attention distributed across the castle's defensive perimeter in a way that ensures no section of wall goes unobserved for any meaningful length of time. Medieval castle garrisons took the watch seriously with the focused intensity of people who understood that the gap in attention was exactly what an enemy needed, and the records of castle management, the household ordinances, the garrison orders, the accounts of castle constables, reflect a genuine institutional investment in making sure the night watch functioned. The watchman on the wall tonight is doing something that sounds simple and is in practice quite demanding. He is walking. He is looking outward into the darkness beyond the walls, which is very complete and offers very little to see but must be looked at anyway, because the alternative, assuming nothing is out there because nothing can be seen, is the kind of assumption that ends careers and occasionally lives. He is listening, which in the dark is the more useful sense, for the particular sounds that do not belong to the night's background, the sound of movement in the ditch, the sound of equipment being assembled, the sound of people trying to be quiet in ways that create a specific quality of almost silence that the practiced ear can distinguish from the real thing. He is also cold, in a way that goes beyond what you are experiencing in the hall. The wall walk is exposed to the full force of whatever the night is doing meteorologically, and tonight the wind has been making its presence known since before you arrived. Stone battlements at the top of a tower are not a comfortable place to stand in winter, and the medieval garrison was equipped against this with varying degrees of success. Heavy wool cloaks, hoods, the kind of layered garment that prioritizes thermal retention over elegance. Some castles provided small guard rooms or mural chambers set into the wall thickness where the watchman could shelter briefly between his circuits. Small stone boxes just large enough for a man to stand in out of the direct wind, which offered relative rather than absolute warmth, but were nonetheless valued enough to be mentioned in architectural accounts as deliberate provisions for the garrison's welfare. The watch schedule divided the night into periods, typically between 2 and 4 watches, depending on the garrison's size and the threat level, and each period was assigned to a specific group of men who would then be relieved by the next group. The transitions were managed with a formality that reflected their importance. The outgoing watch confirmed to the incoming watch that all was well, or reported what was not, and the incoming watch took up their positions with the explicit understanding that the safety of everyone sleeping inside those walls was now their specific responsibility. This handover, repeated several times through the night at every castle in the medieval world, was one of those small repeated rituals of duty that history tends to overlook in favor of the dramatic events that the ritual existed to prevent. There is something worth sitting with here about the relationship between the sleeping and the watching in a medieval castle. The sleepers, the lord in his curtained bed, the household on their hall pallets, the servants in their corners and alcoves and stable-adjacent sleeping spots, slept because others were watching. Their rest was not self-sufficient. It was actively enabled by the wakefulness of other people who had, in a very real sense, taken on the night's dangers so that the sleepers could be safely unconscious. The watch was not just a military function. It was a social contract, a gift of wakefulness given by some so that others could sleep. Now let us go to the kitchen. The castle kitchen, that separate building we noticed when you arrived, kept at a prudent distance from the main hall by every architect who had ever seen what happens when a kitchen fire gets ambitious, is not quiet tonight. It is not quiet on any night, because the castle kitchen operates on a time cycle that is partially inverted from the rest of the household. Its most intensive work beginning well before dawn and continuing through the morning in a sustained effort to produce the food that the household will consume at its main meal of the day. The head baker has been awake for hours already. The bread in a medieval castle is not a side dish. It is a structural element of every meal, consumed in quantities that modern people find slightly alarming, serving as plate and utensil as well as food in the form of the trencher. A thick slice of stale bread used as a foundation for other dishes and then either eaten or distributed to the poor at the meal's end, requires preparation that must begin the night before to allow for proper proving of the dough. The sour starter culture that gives medieval bread its characteristic flavor has been fed and managed with the careful attention of something valuable, which it is, and the dough mixed and set to rise in the warm part of the kitchen near the banked fire, covered with cloth and monitored with the professional anxiety of bakers throughout history who have learned that dough has opinions and those opinions are not always convenient. The kitchen fire never goes entirely out. Banking it for the night, reducing it to a bed of coals covered with ash, which will retain heat through the dark hours and can be rebuilt quickly in the morning, is a skilled operation, and the overnight maintenance of that banked fire is someone's specific job. A fire that goes completely out in the night is a problem. Not a catastrophe but a setback that costs time and effort to correct, and in winter conditions the difference between a properly banked kitchen fire and a dead one can be measured in hours of morning delay. The person charged with maintaining it through the night sits in the kitchen in the particular companionship of the warm dark, occasionally nudging the coals, listening to the building breathe. There is a specific medieval word. The English records use the night watch of the kitchen for this overnight firekeeping role, and the people who held it were compensated slightly differently from day workers, their extra pay reflecting both the antisocial hours and the particular responsibility of being the last line of defense between the castle's cooking capacity and a very cold morning. Alongside the baker and the firekeeper, the kitchen at night might contain one or more kitchen servants doing the slow work of preparation that does not require heat but does require time, cleaning and sorting dried legumes, peeling and chopping root vegetables, preparing the complex spice mixtures that medieval cooking required in quantities that reflect both genuine culinary purpose and the social performance of wealth that expensive spices enabled. The smell of the kitchen at this hour is extraordinary. The warm char of banked coals, the yeast and grain smell of proving bread dough, the sharp green smell of cut herbs, and underneath all of it the residual smell of the previous day's cooking, the fat and the roasted meat and the complex caramelized depths of a sauce reduced for too long. If the great hall is the castle's social smell, the kitchen at night is its working smell, the smell of purposeful human labor continuing in the dark. Go further into the castle, through passages and upstairs, and find the sick. Because the castle contains sick people tonight, as it contains sick people most nights. The medieval world had a relationship with illness that was more immediate and more constant than our own. Not because medieval people were uniquely unhealthy, though certain conditions of their world made specific illnesses more common, but because the management of illness happened within the household rather than being externalized to medical institutions. The sick person in a medieval castle was cared for in the castle, by the castle's people, in a space set aside for them within the castle's domestic geography. A prosperous castle might have something approaching an infirmary room, a space with a bed and some provision for warmth, used for the care of household members who were too ill to function normally but not ill enough to require the intervention of the nearest monastery's genuine infirmary facilities. In smaller or less organized households, the sick person was simply in their usual sleeping space but attended more carefully, given the better food that the household's resources could provide and the medical attention that the period's medical practice could offer. Somebody is sitting up with the sick person tonight. This is not optional. Leaving a seriously ill person unattended through the night was understood as a failure of both practical care and Christian duty, and the records of medieval households include references to the overnight nursing of sick members with a matter-of-factness that reflects its normalcy. The person sitting up is probably not a trained medical practitioner. The physician or apothecary is a daytime resource. And in any case, most castle households relied on the household's own accumulated medical knowledge, supplemented by the advice of the nearest clergyman or the nearest person with a reputation for medical competence, which was often the same person. The overnight nurse is likely a senior female servant or a family member, applying the household's standard remedies, herbal preparations, warming drinks, poultices, prayer, with the practical competence of experience. The remedies available in a medieval household for nighttime illness management are worth a brief inventory, because they are not as primitive as the stereotype suggests and not as effective as we might wish. Herbal preparations. Teas and decoctions made from plants whose medicinal properties were partly accurate by modern pharmaceutical standards, partly ineffective but harmless, and partly a complex interaction of genuine active compounds and placebo effect that is difficult to disentangle, were the primary pharmaceutical toolkit. Feverfew for fever, willow bark preparations for pain, valerian for sleeplessness, a range of preparations for cough and digestive complaints that varied by region and by household tradition. The sick person's sleep was monitored for the specific qualities that medieval medicine used as diagnostic and prognostic indicators: the quality of the breathing, the presence or absence of fever sweats, the character of any sounds made during sleep, and the overnight nurse's observations would be reported to the household's medical authority in the morning. There is also, in the castle tonight, the person who simply cannot sleep. Not the watchman doing his duty, not the baker doing his job, not the nurse doing her care, but the person lying on their pallet in the hall or their bed in the upper chambers who is awake because the night will not take them, because the body's machinery of rest has declined to engage, because the mind is running through its inventory of worries with the focused efficiency it reserves for the small hours of the night when nothing else is available to distract it. Medieval medical literature addresses insomnia. It is called by various names, the most evocative being a Latin phrase that translates roughly as the fleeing of sleep, which captures exactly the experience of lying there watching sleep refuse to come, with the same systematic seriousness it brings to other medical problems. The recommended treatments for medieval insomnia are a combination of the genuinely sensible and the historically specific. Warm baths before bed, where facilities permitted. Specific dietary adjustments, avoiding heavy or spiced food in the evening, consuming certain calming preparations. The use of particular aromatic herbs in the sleeping space, chosen for their sedative properties, some of which have genuine pharmacological support and some of which are operating entirely on the basis of their smell being pleasant and smell being a surprisingly powerful modulator of psychological state. Prayer and the reading of devotional texts, which served both the spiritual purpose of proper preparation for sleep and the practical purpose of giving the wakeful mind something gentle and non-stimulating to rest on. And then there is the person who is awake because they are afraid of the dark. Not metaphorically, not in a way that requires psychological unpacking. Simply afraid of the specific quality of darkness that the medieval night produces, the complete, stone-walled, lamp-extinguished dark that we catalogued earlier, in a way that is both entirely understandable and not something that medieval culture provided much formal support for. The fear of darkness in the medieval period was associated with spiritual weakness, with insufficient faith in divine protection, with the kind of credulity about the night's supernatural inhabitants that the theologically sophisticated were supposed to have risen above. The person who was genuinely afraid of the dark had a problem that their world did not straightforwardly accommodate, and the solutions available to them were essentially the same solutions offered for general nocturnal anxiety: more prayer, better spiritual preparation. The company of other sleepers. The company of other sleepers helped, genuinely. We keep coming back to this because it keeps mattering. The person afraid of the dark in a hall full of sleeping people is less alone with their fear than the person afraid of the dark in a private room. And the medieval arrangement of communal sleep, whatever its discomforts, provided this particular reassurance as a structural feature rather than something that had to be specially arranged. Somewhere in the castle tonight, a baby is awake. Babies in the medieval period observed their own sleep schedule with the serene indifference to household needs that babies in all periods maintain. And the baby awake at this hour is someone's specific problem to manage, which they are doing in the time-honored manner of carrying the baby around and making rhythmic sounds and hoping the transition to sleep happens before the person doing the carrying reaches the end of their resources. The baby's cries, when they come, penetrates stone with a fidelity that says something about the acoustic properties of infant vocal cords that the architects did not account for. The priest in the chapel has just finished his night office. He is the person who has been most purposefully awake through the first half of this night. His wakefulness structured and voluntary and theologically meaningful, the hours of the liturgy giving his consciousness a shape that the watchman's patrol and the baker's bread-making give to theirs. He sits for a moment in the chapel's cold quiet, the lamp burning beside him, before preparing for the second office that the night will require. The castle breathes. The watch changes on the walls. The bread dough rises slowly in the kitchen warmth. The firekeeper nudges the coals. And in the hall, your second sleep is doing its work, lighter and stranger than the first, full of the images that the night delivers to those who have prayed and eaten and lived a full day inside these stone walls. Dawn is coming. It is not here yet, but the night has passed its deepest point, and something, not light, not quite, but the memory of light, the expectation of it, is beginning to change the quality of the dark. Morning in the medieval castle is not a gentle thing, but it is coming, and it has its own rituals and its own surprises, and we are going to meet it together. The dark is changing. You can feel it before you can see it, which sounds like the kind of thing people say for poetic effect but is, in the stone-walled acoustic world of the medieval castle, literally true. The quality of the silence outside the walls has shifted. Not louder, not quieter, but differently textured, as though the night has exhaled something it was holding and replaced it with something else. The birds are responsible for the first audible signal, and they begin earlier than you would expect, well before any light is visible, a tentative single voice somewhere beyond the walls followed by a second and then, with gathering confidence, the full morning assembly of whatever birds have chosen the castle's eaves and the trees beyond the gatehouse as their residential address. Medieval people tracked the birds. Not as hobbyists, not as the organized ornithological recreation that would develop in later centuries, but as practical timekeepers and weather readers, integrating the bird's behavior into the general system of natural signals by which the night's hours were navigated. The cockerel, kept in every castle that maintained a working farmyard, which was most of them, served a function so reliable and so universally understood that it appears in medieval literature as the standard metaphor for dawn's announcement, the alarm clock that required no winding and no management beyond not eating it. The cockerel's crow was not just informational. It was, in the theological dimension of the night that we have been inhabiting, significant. In Christian tradition, the cock's crow marked the boundary between the night's dangerous hours and the relative safety of the approaching day, the moment at which the forces that walked in darkness retreated. The cock's crow in the Passion narrative was the marker of Peter's betrayal and, by extension, the threshold between the night of spiritual crisis and the morning of consequence. When the cockerel in the castle yard begins its announcement, something in the hall shifts. Not everyone wakes. The second sleep is doing its work, and the deeper sleepers do not surface yet. But the hall's collective consciousness moves closer to the boundary between sleep and waking, the way a tide moves up a beach in small advances before the definitive arrival. People begin to turn, to adjust, to make the unconscious micro-movements of bodies preparing to leave sleep without having yet made the decision to do so. The watchman on the wall, who has been in continuous cold attendance through the night's final hours, marks the dawn with something approaching personal relief. His shift ends with the light, or near enough to it, and the emotional quality of the last hour of the watch, when dawn is coming but not yet here, when the darkness has thinned but not broken, when the long patience of the night's duty is about to conclude, is described in enough medieval sources to constitute something like a recognized experience. The watch's end is not dramatic. It is simply the quiet arrival of the thing you have been waiting for. The kitchen has been gradually accelerating through the last hours of darkness. The bread that was set to rise last night is now ready for the oven, and the stone oven, a separate chamber built into the kitchen's masonry, heated by burning wood inside it and then raking the coals out before the bread goes in, so that the bread bakes in the retained heat of the stone rather than directly over flame, has been fired and is approaching temperature in a process that takes longer than you would like and must therefore be started earlier than seems strictly necessary. The oven's heat is significant and pleasurable. The kitchen in the pre-dawn hours warmer than anywhere else in the castle except possibly the Lord's curtained bed. and the kitchen staff moving through their morning preparation carry themselves with the particular energy of people who have been warm and purposeful in the dark while everyone else was sleeping. The smell of bread baking in a stone oven in the early morning is one of those smells that operates below the analytical level of the brain, going straight to something older and more immediate. It penetrates stone, it penetrates sleep, it moves through the hall in the early morning air that comes with the first opening of doors and hits the half-waking occupants of the hall's palates with a force that is not quite waking them but is absolutely participating in the process. Smell, remember, is the sense most directly connected to the brain's older, more emotional architecture, and the smell of fresh bread hitting the nose of someone in the shallow end of their second sleep produces a response that is essentially involuntary. The hall is beginning to smell like morning. Light arrives at the castle's windows with a gradualism that is different from the switch-flip quality of our artificially lit dawns. The windows of the great hall narrow, remember, defensive, not designed for light admission. Catch the earliest gray of pre-dawn and transmit it as thin pale lines against the walls, not illuminating anything exactly but changing the quality of the darkness from absolute to relative. You can begin to distinguish shapes. The far end of the hall, which was last night an undifferentiated dark, becomes a set of shadows with topology, the shapes of sleeping people, the angles of leaned trestle tables, the long rectangle of a bench. This gradual lighting is, from a biological perspective, exactly what the human visual system evolved to experience as morning. The slow increase in blue spectrum light that natural dawn produces is precisely what the circadian system uses to begin its waking sequence, gradually reducing melatonin, gradually increasing cortisol, preparing the body for the transition to active wakefulness in a process that takes 30 to 40 minutes under natural conditions. Medieval people, who went to bed and woke with the light rather than with artificial illumination on a fixed schedule, were living inside this biological rhythm with a completeness that most modern people never experience. Their bodies knew what time it was in a visceral, hormonal way that our artificial light environment has largely disrupted. The modern experience of feeling genuinely alert only after coffee and a shower is, among other things, the experience of a body whose morning systems have been confused by artificial light and are catching up. In the solar, the Lord is already awake. Not dramatically awake, not bolting upright and reaching for a sword, which is the castle awakening scene that drama tends to favor, but in that state of easy, clear-eyed morning consciousness that is the reward of the two-sleep pattern functioning as intended. He has come through the first sleep and the watch and the second sleep. His body has done its work, and he surfaces into morning with the particular equanimity of someone who has, within the constraints of his world, slept well. The body servant, who has spent the night on his trundle bed outside the curtained main bed, waking and sleeping in the light way of someone who is professionally alert even in his rest, like a parent sleeping with the awareness that a child might need them, is already on his feet. This is his moment of maximum usefulness, the morning ritual that his role exists to perform, and he performs it with the quiet efficiency of long practice. The bed curtains are drawn back. This is, again, a ritual with physical and symbolic dimensions simultaneously. The drawing back of the curtains returns the Lord to the shared world from the private dark, reintroduces the room's ambient temperature to the sleeping space in a way that is mildly shocking after the curtain's warmth, and signals the formal beginning of the day. The medieval morning does not wait for you to feel ready. It has a schedule, and the schedule is known, and it begins now. The chamber is cold, because all castle rooms are cold in the morning before the fire has had time to establish itself, and the fire in the solar's wall fireplace, which the body servant has been building up from its overnight banking in the past few minutes, is not yet warm enough to have made a meaningful difference. The floor, which you are not touching because you are upstairs observing rather than participating, is a stone floor at its morning temperature, which is an experience that the wealthier members of the household avoided through the use of rushes or, in particularly well-appointed chambers, wooden boards or the rare luxury of a small rug or fur mat placed specifically at the bedside for the moment of first contact between sleeping feet and morning floor. The Lord dresses. This is not a simple operation and is not intended to be, because dressing in a medieval noble household is a performance of status as much as a practical preparation for the day. The layers come on in a specific sequence, the linen undergarments first, the shirt that has been the sleeping garment laid aside and a fresh one put on if the household's laundry management allows for this, which in a prosperous household it does, then the hose, the doublet or tunic, the outer garments appropriate to the season and the day's anticipated requirements. Each layer has a correct approach and a correct fastening and a correct relationship to the layers above and below it, and the body servant manages this sequence with the practiced attention of someone who has done it every morning for years and has strong feelings about doing it correctly. In the Great Hall, the waking is less choreographed and more chaotic. People surface from their second sleep in their own time, which in the early morning light means a wave of waking moving through the hall over the course of 20 or 30 minutes. Those who have slept nearest the fire generally waking earliest, whether because the fire's light reaches them first or because the fire's sound as it rebuilds wakes them, or simply because the warmest sleepers tend to sleep most lightly toward morning, and those in the corners and the draft zones surfacing last, often with the specific reluctance of people who have found their warmest position just as the morning has come to reclaim them. The first sounds of the waking hall are unglamorous. Coughing, as the morning air reaches lungs that have spent the night processing smoke. The sounds of people standing up from pallets, which in some cases involves a negotiation with joints and muscles that have spent the night in close conference with a stone floor and have opinions about the experience. The dogs, who have been awake for the past 15 minutes with the easy morning alertness of creatures not troubled by the two-sleep pattern or the theological complexities of the night, are on their feet and investigating the hall's morning possibilities with the enthusiasm of the professionally optimistic. The pallets are rolled and stacked. This is one of the morning's first tasks, performed with varying degrees of efficiency and willingness by the people who slept on them, transforming the hall from its nighttime dormitory configuration back to the daytime operational space it needs to be within the next hour or two. The trestle tables that were leaned against the walls last night come back down onto their supports. The benches are repositioned. The rush floor, disturbed by the night's occupation, is rearranged with whatever quick attention is available before the day's business begins in earnest. The chapel bell rings for prime, the first of the day's prayer hours, marking the official beginning of the liturgical day with the dawn's arrival, and the sound moves through the castle with the authority of a signal that everyone recognizes and responds to according to their own degree of religious observance. For the most devout in the household, prime means an actual visit to the chapel, a brief attendance at the morning office that starts the day in the devotional framework that the theological understanding of time requires. For others, it is a reminder, a marker, an acknowledgement of the day's beginning that is noted internally without necessarily producing physical movement toward the chapel door. For the kitchen staff, who have been awake for hours and are currently managing the bread's progress, it is a background announcement with no immediate practical consequences. The Lord descends from the solar. This is a moment with a specific social weight in the medieval castle's daily choreography, and it is performed with an awareness of that weight on all sides. His arrival in the hall signals the formal beginning of the household's day, the point at which the castle shifts from its overnight operating mode to its daytime one, and the household adjusts to his presence with the collective attentiveness of people whose world is organized around a central person. Greetings are exchanged. There are specific forms for this: morning salutations that acknowledge the night's passing and the day's beginning with a formality that we might find excessive before coffee, but which was simply the normal register of polite address in the period. The steward approaches with the morning's business. Breakfast, such as it is, begins. Here is the thing about medieval breakfast that tends to surprise people. It was not, for most of the medieval period and most of the social spectrum, a substantial or formal meal. The main meal of the day was dinner, served in the late morning or early afternoon, and the first food of the day was typically light, informal, and almost apologetic, bread from last night's baking or the morning's first production, some ale, perhaps some cold meat from the previous day's dinner if you were of the class that had access to it, perhaps some cheese. The elaborate morning meal is a later development. The medieval morning's food was fuel, taken standing up or in passing, while the day's first business was already beginning. You sit with your bread and your ale in the brightening hall, feeling the night leave your body in the gradual way that mornings work, and you take stock. You have been cold, intermittently and persistently. You have been smoky. You have slept on a stone floor with a dog on your legs and a cat's periodic commentary on your warmth management. You have navigated a darkness more complete than you were prepared for, inside a building whose every surface expressed its indifference to your comfort through the medium of temperature. You have shared your sleeping space with 30-odd people, multiple dogs, professional cats, resident rodents, and the ambient awareness of what medieval theology understood to be a permeable night through which various forces moved with intentions ranging from divine to decidedly otherwise. And yet, the bread is warm. The ale is doing what ale does in the morning, which is more complicated than it sounds. The hall is filling with light through its narrow windows, thin winter light that nonetheless transforms the space from its nighttime character to its daytime one, catching the smoke haze near the ceiling and turning it golden, picking out the colors of the tapestry on the far wall that were invisible last night. The dogs are at the door, hoping. The fire is properly established now, radiating the kind of steady, confident warmth that makes the memory of last night's cold feel slightly dramatic. The castle is awake, and you are awake inside it, carrying the night on you in the way that nights leave themselves on the people who have passed through them, in the smell of smoke in your hair, in the specific knowledge of what a stone floor feels like after 8 hours, in the memory of the hall's amber dark and the breathing of 30 sleeping people and the watchman's footsteps above on the battlement, marking time in the cold. Historians still argue about what daily life in a medieval castle felt like from the inside, whether the discomforts we catalog from our comfortable distance were experienced as hardship by the people who lived them, or simply as the unremarkable texture of existence. The question may not have a clean answer. Both things are probably true simultaneously, in the way that most things about human experience are. It was hard and it was normal, it was cold and it was home, it was loud and it was familiar, it was frightening in the dark and it was warm with company in ways that are solitary. Climate-controlled, individually optimized nights are not. You were here for one night. They lived here for years. And now the morning has them, and they are moving into its tasks and its rituals and its requirements with the purposeful energy of people who slept their sleep and woke their waking and are ready for the day. The cockerel in the yard is still going, because cockerels are not known for editorial restraint. The bread smells extraordinary. And somewhere above you, in the solar, the body servant is folding the Lord's sleeping garments with the careful attention of someone who will do exactly this again tomorrow morning, and the morning after, and the morning after that, until the castle itself decides otherwise. And now, let the day recede for a moment. Let the sounds of the waking castle soften, the clatter of the hall's morning work, the dogs at the door, the chapel bell's last echo, and let them blur together into something gentler, the way the castle itself blurs at the edges when you are tired enough to stop cataloging it and simply rest inside it. You have traveled far tonight, further in some ways than distance measures. You have been inside a world that ran on different rules, different rhythms, different fears and comforts, and you have felt some small portion of its texture against your skin, the cold of the floor, the warmth of the fire, the weight of wool, the sound of breathing in the dark. The medieval night was not a gap between days. It was its own country with its own geography, the hierarchy of the sleeping hall, the privacy of the curtained bed, the watch's open door, and its own population, those asleep and those awake and those moving between the two states with a fluency that the two-sleep world allowed. It had its own government, in a way, the theological framework of the prayer hours, the practical authority of the watchman's round, the social contract of the shared warmth. It is passing now, that country. The light is here and the morning has it, and the day will be loud and busy and full of things that need doing. But for just a little while longer, let the fire's warmth hold you. Let the bread smell be enough. Let the darkness of last night settle in your memory not as a hardship survived, but as a place visited. Strange and cold and crowded and alive, full of smoke and prayer and dogs and the sound of other people breathing in the dark. You were there. Now you are here, in this warm quiet, drifting softly toward your own rest. The castle walls hold their cold outside. In here, in this amber and this softness, let the night do its final work. Let your eyes close. Let the breathing slow. Let the watch end. Sweet dreams.